All right, welcome to the 15th workshop in the Return to Freud. In this workshop, we're going to be directly continuing our exploration of the 5 lectures of psychoanalysis. We covered the first 2 lectures of this 5-part series in the previous workshop. And again, the context for these lectures is that it's the introduction of psychoanalysis to a North American context. Both Freud and Jung were present and collaborating at this point in the development of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis had been, established more or less for about 2 decades at this point, developed theoretically and clinically. This is basically a nice overview. If you're just starting out with this workshop series, this is really a nice overview for sort of where psychoanalysis is at this point in its maturation. So I'm going to share my screen, and let's get into it. All right. So again, like I said, lectures 3, 4, and 5. There's Freud on the left, Jung on the right. Just as Freud starts the 3rd lecture with a correction, I also want to start off this lecture with a correction, which was actually brought to my attention by Mika after the last workshop, which is that I didn't make a sufficient enough distinction on the difference between the psychological theories of Janet versus the psychological theories of Freud. If you go back to part 2, Freud here does make sort of a description of Janet's theory of the mind versus his theory of the mind. So I just wanted to highlight that because Freud's theory of the mind is counterintuitive, and it does require a little bit of a spin in our thinking to really understand what he's getting at. Basically, on the left-hand side there, you see the direct quotes from the part 2 of the lecture, where Janet's theory is this innate weakness of the power of psychical synthesis and, quote unquote, a difficulty holding a multiplicity of processes into a unity. Whereas Freud is emphasizing basically a splitting of the mind and a disassociation of the personality, and a view of the origin of the hysteria, the neuroses, in the splitting of consciousness. So what I would say here on the right-hand side, I just sort of have an idea here of what the consequences of the difference of these theories are, is I think that Janet's theory would lead us to this idea of, again, building a strong ego and emphasizing a sort of synthesis of the personality. Whereas with Freud, I think you have more the metaphysics of contradiction, where you're working with the split of subjectivity as opposed to trying to synthesize a multiplicity into a unity necessarily. You're trying to sort of, you're trying to work with the very split of subjectivity itself. And this is a paradoxical difference. And I think that ultimately the difference could be that for Janet's theory, you have this idea that the symptom, namely the hysteria and the neuroses, is something that needs to be gotten rid of. It's for sort of like a strong ego, which would manifest as a unity. Whereas with Freud's theory, you can almost see the hysteria and the neuroses as a positive thing, almost spiritual illness as a positive thing, and that you're working with the very split itself. And in order to sort of capture that, I've sort of made an image there of what I think Freud's trying to get at with the consciousness and the unconscious, where you have conscious identity, you have unconscious identity. Of course, this is a simplified representation and the logic of A equals B, but basically you're having the very split is the psyche itself, and it's not a unity necessarily, but it's just the psyche is what splits into an unconscious and a conscious sort of dimension, and then the dynamics of repression, which we went into in the 2nd lecture, and we're going to continue to go in today, are operating in the very awareness of this split. And I don't know, I think this was maybe just a useful clarification if it wasn't clear enough in the last lecture. And again, I made a little bit of a mistake there. So with parts 1 and 2, we basically covered the origin of psychoanalysis and emotional and spiritual illness, the neuroses and the psychoses. We covered the split mind. So again, that's the correction, the emphasis here on the split mind of conscious and unconsciousness and the mechanism of repression. And then in parts 3, 4, and 5, which we're going to cover today, we're going to get into the methods for analyzing symptom formation. We're going to go into the original cause of symptoms as problems of infantile sexuality and the development of the libido. And we're going to go into, finally, the aim, ultimately, of psychoanalysis as a therapeutic mechanism to deal with the sort of discord or the asymmetry between our fantasies and reality. So first, the methods for analyzing symptom formation, namely free association, dream interpretation, and faulty acts, which I think gets sort of less attention, but it's extremely interesting to pay attention to all of the bungled actions that we engage in day-to-day life. So starting out here, this is sort of a rehash of the second lecture, basically, that there are two forces operating in not just the symptomatic patient, but basically all human beings to different degrees. One, in analysis, the attempt to bring a forgotten idea to consciousness, and two, the resistance to the forgotten idea being conscious, namely the mechanism of repression. And here, of course, this is where Freud is emphasizing the importance of free association over hysteria because, oh, no, sorry, not over hypnosis, rather. The reason being is because with hypnosis, you miss some of the dynamics of the repression and you could have it basically go on unchecked, and you have to work through the resistances with the free association. And so the dynamics of this for an extremely symptomatic patient is the greater the force of repression, namely the greater the resistance to the forgotten idea being brought conscious, the greater the distortion of the symptom. So basically creates a more difficult analysis. And so you could think here that for someone who's extremely symptomatic, the level of resistance might be so strong that you're dealing with extremely negative emotions. You're dealing with extremely negative disturbances. You're going to be dealing with a lot of problems of transference, for example. We're going to get into transference, basically where the patient will be projecting onto the analyst imagistic representations that are sort of effects of its earlier relationships with its caregivers or parents as opposed to the actual analyst. But this is sort of like the basic dynamics here he's trying to set up. So the symptom as distortion, in order to capture here this idea of the symptom as distortion, is the idea that whatever the neurotic or the hysteric is dealing with in its symptom is a distortion of the original disturbance or the original trauma that, and he gives here an example for us to understand here how a psychoanalyst works with reference to comedy, because he says the symptom is similar or analogous to jokes. And of course, recall here that Freud in one of his early works does write a book titled Jokes and Their Relationship to the Unconscious, namely saying that how jokes tend to function is that they work via indirect reference. So if you want to say something uncomfortable, if you want to say something insulting, if you want to say something that would basically harm another person's identity, a joke is a good way to do it in an indirect way, as it alludes to what you're trying to get to by omitting sort of direct reference to it. And that he's basically saying that the symptom here functions in a similar way, that the symptom is a distortion of really what the patient is complaining about is not the real problem. What the patient is complaining about is a distortion of the real problem, and the free association is the path to that. The analytic work is a path to that. So In order to discover the unconscious complex of ideas that are causing the symptom, again, we use free association, which is indirect speech, namely that you're not trying to get the subject to talk in normative, like in a coherent narrative. Like, example, for me right now, I'm trying to organize my speech in a coherent narrative for the point of sort of clearly communicating information to all of you. However, if I was trying to get to some unconscious material inside myself, the best way would be to basically freely associate by suspending my own critical judgment, suspending my own rational capacities, suspending my own egoic structure in some sense. And he even says that the most important in free association is for the patient to suspend critical judgment to the level where he or she is able to vocalize extremely disagreeable content, content that's, of course, potentially politically incorrect, potentially destabilizing for their identity, potentially undermining their identity. Well, by definition, in some sense, undermining their identity. Speech which is nonsensical, totally incorrect, has no meaning, seeming totally irrelevant, that this is actually the pathway to the core of the unconscious, not the sort of sensical, rational sort of, again, just exactly the speech I'm giving now. So this is a paradox here of how the analyst works in some sense. And the associative material, here he says, which the patient, quote unquote, contemptuously rejects under the influence of resistance, serves the analyst. So basically saying things which, again, are extremely disagreeable to the patient's identity. This is what makes psychoanalysis so difficult. This is what makes Freud's method both, on the one hand, so interesting, and on the other hand, so, in some sense, problematic to institutionalize and really teach, because you really have to go through a lot of resistance, meaning deep negative emotions, and also it requires a lot on the part of the patient to be able to do this. You can sort of see why some people may have found hypnosis to be a more agreeable method, just because you basically bypass the symbolic order. And the symbolic order here, I think, in our contemporary context, is coming back with a vengeance. Like we can't bypass it for the imaginary, so to speak. So here you have a few technical methods. Here we say, as we went through the free association, he sort of mentions Jung here, and actually strongly supports Jung in his exploration of associative experimentation. He also highlights very strongly dream interpretation as central to someone who is interested in themselves becoming an analyst, and also analyzing their own psyche, that's the strongest core of psychoanalysis. Here, this is the lecture where he gives the, more or less famous quote that the interpretation of dreams is the royal road to the knowledge of the unconscious. Basically studying the imagistic material that we often forget and dismiss in waking consciousness. And finally, I think another very important dimension of technical methods in psychoanalysis is the analysis of faulty and haphazard actions, and the way in which some of these, and we're going to go through what some of these actions are, but the way in which some of these actions actually point towards a deep meaning of one's psychical life, and that they're actually not as random or irrelevant as many of us assume. So, as it relates to dream problems, one of the problems here for us is that waking consciousness, namely what we are right now, treat dreams with quote unquote contempt and dismissal. We often feel like dreams are irrelevant and unimportant, even though, and Freud seems to here suggest that this is a historical and also a class-based pretension and arrogance on the part of waking consciousness, because he suggests that in antiquity and among common people, he says often lower class people, that dreams are attached tending to a mythological significance, namely that common people or people in ancient times viewed dreams as extremely important and revealing the future. Whereas Freud disagrees with that common sense understanding, or rather that mythological understanding of the ancient world. He suggests that actually, yes, dreams are meaningful, not in the way the ancient world presupposed, but actually in a way that dreams are the fulfillment of wishes which were aroused in the previous day. And of course, we've covered a lot of this in previous lectures on dreams. Namely, we actually covered Freud's paper on dreams, which I would recommend going back to that workshop if you're interested in going into the full depth of what Freud has to say about dreams. But here we can bring up what I think is the most important angle, which is the distinction between childhood dreams versus adult dreams. Namely, that child dreams are simple and perfectly intelligible. Namely, that when you analyze a child's dream, it's easy to tell that the dream is basically a wish fulfillment from the previous day, whereas with an adult, the dreams are unintelligible distortions. So here we have the formation of the symptom, we have the formation of the adult's identity, which is a sacrifice for the, here I think he actually has a great quote about that, where he basically says that the adult's identity is a sacrifice for painfully acquired civilization. I just think it's a brilliant formulation here, and just it's worth so much time thinking about that. And then again, the very core of, and this is for anyone who's interested in analyzing their own dreams rather, that the very core and simple mechanism by which analysis functions and the uniqueness of psychoanalytic theory in relationship to ancient theories of dreams is the distinction between the manifest content, which is again the dream distortion, versus the latent content, which is the original dream thoughts. And the idea here is that in analysis, you unravel the manifest content to reach the dream thought itself, the latent content, and that will give you basically the simple and intelligible nature of the dream as a wish fulfillment from the previous day. Of course, when we're dealing with adults, we are dealing with material that will stretch back all the way to childhood. So he says here that the unconscious psyche uses its own symbolism. He's mentioned several times that this symbolism is observable in our myths and fairy tales. So you can say here that great writers of great fiction, and some of our greatest mythological stories in history, religious stories perhaps as well, are expressions of the unconscious. I don't know here exactly where the distinction is to be made between Freud and Jung on the, and this would be interesting to talk about actually, where the distinction is to be made between Freud and Jung on the idea of the collective unconscious, and what really the differences here are between the two understandings of unconscious symbolism and its relationship to historical literature. But nonetheless, what is central for Freudian analysis is the emotion of anxiety. And here we can often recall the contemporary philosopher Slavoj Žižek with his affirmation that anxiety is the only emotion that doesn't lie, quote unquote. And that the anxiety is the core of the basically the mechanism of repression to prevent the repressed wishes from coming to consciousness. And in that sense, anxiety can be a useful guide for anyone who is interested in sort of a deeper understanding of themselves, I think, in a psychoanalytic sense. So dream interpretation here leads to the core of the psychic complexes or the symptoms. And we're going to get into a little bit about what actually that core looks like, because according to Freud, that core actually has a very simple, what analysis reveals is that what that core is actually quite simple, and both beautiful and disturbing. I guess depending on your perspective on it, we'll get to that. So here, going a little bit deeper into the third mechanism beyond free association and dream interpretation, that of faulty actions, here namely forgetting things, slips of the tongue. I've had a really weird slips of the tongue in the past, bungled actions, and also losing and breaking objects. That for Freud, none of these things are totally random, rather here expressing, we'll get into this as well, the determinism of the mind, but that faulty actions have a high meaning, and that consciousness treats these faulty actions as insignificant under a conspiracy of silence. I think what here is remarkable about Freud, and which is particularly evident in his earliest books, is that he pays attention to things with extreme awareness and extreme attention to detail, where most people simply find things to be insignificant, namely, again, these day-to-day actions which we just simply overlook and find insignificant. For Freud, is highly significant, and he pays a lot of attention to them. I think this is one of the most remarkable things which is clear in analyzing his writings. He's basically saying here that the faulty actions give expression to impulses and intentions. We might say here the core of unconscious motivation, which is kept back and hidden from consciousness. And that just makes so much sense if we think about unconscious motivation and even the mystery of our own motivation systems, which is totally missing and totally absent in, for example, the science and psychology of behaviorism. But here Freud is putting this as extremely central, that the unconscious motivation is always in operation. And when we are engaging in actions which basically contradict our egoic consciousness's intention, our egoic consciousness's impulse, that actually what we're dealing with here is the expression of the unconscious itself. It's, I think, so important. So that takes us basically to something that Freud claims is another disturbing thing for the conscious ego, which is the determination of mental life, which is that we don't, and this is here, I think, echoing a modern philosopher like Slavoj Žižek, who problematizes the philosopher as it relates to free will, namely that Žižek often says that the job of the modern philosopher is actually quite modest, namely the sort of the understanding of what freedom means on a deep level, especially after the consequences of psychoanalysis, namely here the proposition that our mental life is largely determined by unconscious motivation, and that nothing is trivial, arbitrary, or haphazard, and that the unconscious motivation emerges not in a singular motive, but rather there's often a multiplicity of motive for every mental occurrence. Here, going back to the original split of consciousness, where multiplicity and unity sort of undergo their dynamic, but the split here is primary. And that the biggest obstacle to analysis here is, quote unquote, the arrogance of consciousness, namely, and this is sort of my addition here, the recognition of contradiction, which I think would be affirmed also by modern thinkers like Alenka Zupancic and Todd McGowan, where they are basically building their philosophies on this idea that we need to affirm contradiction as opposed to reifying a type of egoic coherence in our identity. And again, I think that's back to sort of the understanding of psychoanalysis based on a model of the psyche as a split subject, a divided subject. So that's the end of part 3. Now we're going to go into part 4, switching from the methods of psychoanalysis, again, free association, dream interpretation, faulty actions, and going into the original cause and symptoms of the hysterical and the neurotic psyche as it relates to infantile sexuality and the development of libido. So the pathogenic complexes and repressed wishes of the neurotics can be traced back to early impressions of erotic life, and that there is no sexual difference here as it relates to men and women, that both boys and girls in this sense, that boys and girls, men and women, are both the same when it comes to the way in which their psyche are strongly impacted by quote unquote impressions from erotic life. And that infantile sexuality provides the enormous power for the construction of symptoms. When we think about infantile sexuality and the power here that psychoanalysis is identifying, what we're basically bringing our attention to is a almost hypnotic type of consciousness, basically this type of consciousness which would be absolutely hypnotized by, for example, the mother's embrace and the mother's breast, and also the fact that the child is demanding love and demanding connection in a situation where it finds itself in a body which is extremely impotent, which is extremely at the mercy of forces beyond itself. So you can see here that this force of the childhood sexuality has to contend with a very difficult environment, and it's a very precarious situation, and the tools at the disposal of the child are very, basically lacking. So totally dependent here on the early caregivers and of course the mother. So, and this is in Freud's context, and I think that this actually is still true today. And in Alenka Zupancic, What is Sex?, she actually emphasizes that this is still more true today than ever, that there is a strong resistance to the idea of infantile sexuality, namely a strong resistance to the idea that to think about sexuality outside of the context of reproductive function, to think about sexuality outside of the context of adult sexuality, normative adult sexuality. And I think this is more important again than ever today when we're thinking about the way sexuality is being expressed in a totally polymorphous and polymorphous perverse expression today, in a way that is in some sense alien to Freud's time, but maybe not as much as we think, especially outside of normative Victorian upper class standards, where basically polymorphous perversity is always in some sense the norm. But the child here dominated by libido, what that means is, and this is related to the energetics of the unconscious, is that the child is dominated by a pleasurable feeling and excitation of the body, in the genitals, the oral, the anal, and the urethral orifices and surfaces. He also says the entire skin surface of the body. And that the subject, or the infant rather, is in a state of autoerotic satisfaction, namely sexual satisfaction from its own body. Its entire body is alive with libido. This is manifesting in things like thumb sucking and playing with genitals, but also playing with defecation. And generally, we underestimate, for example, as adults, the way that our energy, the energy of our body, becomes concentrated in the genitals, and basically becomes over concentrated in the genitals and the intellect, the head. And for the infant, this energy is more evenly distributed throughout the entire body. So infantile sexuality gets transformed at a later age. And when this transformation occurs, again, the concentration of energy in the genitals, the dominance of the genital zone, and also the dominance of the head, and then we become, there's another split there. We take an extraneous person as an object, namely adults tend to sexuate between man and woman, although not always. Here, Freud is saying that what is more general is the bifurcation of adult consciousness into active and passive pairs. Namely, you might say, if you don't, active and passive is here probably a more subtle distinction in relationship to what we call masculine and feminine. But what he's saying here, what he's pointing towards here, is that all infants are to some degree homosexual, namely containing both a active and a passive element in their sexual expression, and that this becomes the foundation for a deeper sexuation in adulthood, as expressed, quote unquote, under the dominance of the genital zone, and that mechanisms here of shame and disgust, mechanisms of normative morality, are the methods of repression as it relates to anal satisfaction, as it relates to other forms of oral satisfaction, and basically autoerotic satisfaction. Now, that might be more true in Freud's time than in our time, whereas I think in our time, the force of the shame and the disgust as it relates to some of these autoerotic satisfactions has been lifted and reduced and explored in a more open way, let's say. So as the libido develops, this development can become extremely problematic, namely if it is inhibited, delayed, or incomplete in any dimension, that the subject is at risk in some sense of regression and perversion. And regression here, well, let's first, this is an overview here. We've already covered in many different workshops, but perversion here is, the way Freud is using it, is the alternative to normative sexual expression, namely sexual expression with a non-reproductive aim. And he sees this as an infantile disposition, and also the core of, we're going to get into this a lot more, but the core of regression to expression of sexual energy, namely back to this infantile state. Now, he has a formula for the relationship between the neuroses and the perversions as negative to positive. So one of the common statements I've heard many people say is, quote unquote, perverts do what neurotics think about. So that's a way to think about this relationship between neurotics and perverts, where perverts are basically freely expressing the sexual energy of their unconscious, let's say, whereas neurotics are merely thinking about it. Now, you can also flip it around, because it's not necessarily a good thing that perverts just express their sexual energy, in this way without sort of deeply understanding the unconscious motivation behind this expression. But that's perhaps a way to understand the relationship between Freud's understanding of negative to positive, that, basically the neuroses are a negative of perversion. So libido's development, the child's first sexual objects are related to the parents. And here we get to the core understanding of what's going on in the unconscious motivation. That now Freud's here saying this as a rule, quote unquote, but that the son's wish is to replace the father and be with the mother, whereas the daughter's wish is to replace the mother and be with the father. And that what is being expressed at the core of our dreams, what's being expressed at the core of our unconscious psyche, at the core of our unconscious motivations, is this basic simple mechanism, which is, again, there's something endearing and cute about it, and also something extremely disturbing and, almost horrifying about it. And at the same time, he's saying here that this nuclear complex, this very simple mechanism, sexuated mechanism, is at the core of our neuroses, and perhaps also our psychoses in the modern context. It'd be interesting to think about the way the neuroses and the psychoses relate to this basic rule he's proposing. But he's also emphasizing that this nuclear complex is observable in mythological stories like the Oedipus story and Hamlet. And that the point of psychoanalysis here is the overcoming of childhood residue, namely the overcoming of this weird complex where a son will want to replace his father, kill his father, and be with his mother, and a daughter will wish to replace her mother and be with her father. And that's the end of part 4. Let me just say for, if any of you have, I see someone here has their hand raised, we're going to go fully into, like you're going to be able to talk as much as you like. Just let me finish the presentation and then we're going to be able to go into all this in much detail as possible. So I know this is a little bit long, but we're going through, I just wanted to get through the 5 lectures of psychoanalysis in 2 parts. So we're going to go through the 5th and final part of the 5 lectures with an exploration of the ultimate aim of psychoanalysis, which is here to reconcile, in some sense, this asymmetry that appears in the subject between fantasy and reality. Because here we've gone through the methods, namely the free association, dream interpretation, faulty actions. We've gone through the origin and the cause of the symptoms, namely the infantile sexuality and the complex that emerges at the core of that. Now we're going into ultimately, what are we to do about this situation? What is the aim of psychoanalysis? So, connecting here to the first part, psychoanalysis here is in essence about the emotional and spiritual illness which manifests from libidinal frustration, namely the meeting of our erotic needs as they're governed by the pleasure principle. Whereas when these erotic needs are unmet, that we, quote unquote, take flight into illness in order to find satisfaction away from reality, namely the reality principle as what, not an extra reality principle here following Lacan is not a extra other reality, but it's namely the frustration of the pleasure principle, namely the real as what does not work, the real as what is resisting our desire, let's say. So you here have symptoms as constituting a portion or the whole of a subject's activity, and that the reason why, in some sense, the ego so strongly resists cure is because it is highly attached to its symptom. It doesn't want to let go of its symptom. It does not want to get better in some sense. So regression here, going into connection with the last part of this lecture, is that regression has and again, regression being a regression back to earliest expression of infantile sexuality. So it has a temporal dimension and a formal dimension. The temporal dimension is going back in consciousness to a time when the needs were met, by the mother, by early caregivers, and going back in form to the methods by which one achieved one's needs. Here suckling or coddling or these types of behaviors. So humans in general, Freud suggests, and now this is the crucial distinction. I've tried to emphasize it in many previous workshops, which is that for Freud, there is in some no health subject that in some sense we are in psychotics to some degree. And the reason being that humans in general find reality to be unsatisfying, that humans in general entertain fantasies to supplement the unsatisfying reality, namely wish fulfillments, and that the difference between a neurotic and a healthy person is basically the degree to which they were able to successfully actualize their fantasy, to successfully manifest their fantasy. So he says successful adults, quote unquote, are less susceptible to regression. However, regression is always a risk. It never goes away. And that when a subject, he or she, fails to actualize, manifest their fantasy, so to speak, that this fantasy could always transform into symptoms, and definitely when I analyze myself as it relates to success or failure as an adult, I think that here the huge risk of failure as an adult, and when one fails in adult reality, one should pay close attention to the susceptibility to regression, and it's basically an ever-present threat in some sense. So I have this picture here of monks at a monastery because Freud actually makes a quite interesting comment about his view on monasteries, that people who live a monastic life, people who go off to the monastery, are actually a good example of withdrawing from reality because they're so unsatisfied, so disappointed by the nature of reality. And in some sense, like when you have this image here of the monk as totally shaven and totally without any possessions, what they're here doing is basically rebelling against the unsatisfactory nature of the reality, and the, in some sense, the weakness and the inability to face the real. Now, analysis, and this is why I think conversation between psychoanalysis and traditional spirituality of withdrawal should be put into deeper conversation, because the analytic ethic is different than this monastic ethic, which is the analytic looks for a alternative path to the exploration of fantasy, as opposed to becoming, quote unquote, permanently estranged from reality via regression. So he does give the example here. It seems to me like analysis aligns itself most strongly with art and artistic creation as a method of transforming reality. And here Freud's quote to, quote unquote, escape the doom of neurosis in the process. And that the here the ultimate battle here, which is in some sense never ending, is this attempt not to regress and find oneself in a permanent state of neurosis, basically through the drive of artistic creativity. So again, emphasizing here for Freud that all people are to some degree neurotic, that the struggle with reality, and this is basically psychoanalysis, right? Because the psyche here is understood always in the context of a struggle with reality, or the real, and depends on a type of mental conflict and how one, basically, whether one is capable of bringing one's awareness to the most intimate and the most sensitive mental conflicts that one has to sort of endure. And when you think about it, and especially in the difference between humans and animals, animals, of course, are battling with physical reality just like we are, but they don't have the burden of a psychic life in the way that we have a psychic life. And this creates enormous opportunity for us, but it also creates many risks, namely the risks that psychoanalysis here is identifying in the spiritual illnesses. And again, when we're working with a symptomatic patient, we're going to be dealing with the quote unquote strange phenomenon of transference, which is a affectionate residue of early relationships which are projected onto the analysis. And Freud here emphasizes that analysis does not create transference, that transference is in some sense operative everywhere, which is terrifying. But that transference is operative in all of our relationships. It's merely that analysis attempts to gain conscious control of it, and redirect it towards a more sensible desired aim. Now we're very close to the end here, so bear with me. I know this has been a little bit of an extended presentation, but I think it's worthwhile to go through it in all of its detail. That Freud here emphasizes that there are three main obstacles to recognizing psychoanalysis. The first being, and I think that all of these are still more or less true today, namely that people are unaccustomed to reckoning with a strict and universal determinism of mental life. People like to think that they're more free than they are. I would here just point towards many different spiritual masters of the 20th century who point towards the idea that you cannot be free until you realize the degree to which you're a slave. You cannot be free until you recognize the degree to which you are being controlled by forces which are alien to your egoic consciousness. Namely, the second point, that the pathway for psychoanalysis to getting a deeper understanding of these unconscious mechanisms, these unconscious motivations, is to become comfortable with what your ego perceives to be uncomfortable peculiarities. And that the unconscious here, namely the idea that one might want to kill the father and marry the mother, or replace the mother and be with the father, these types of things, and that these dynamics are operating in our transference relationships at large. Again, why so terrifying? So, and then the third point, people being afraid to do harm with analysis, here the idea that one would replace cultural character with repressed instinct. And here Freud is emphatic that psychoanalysis does not want to replace one's cultural character with repressed instinct, namely that one wants to build a cultural character which is not so deeply split when it comes to repressed instinct, but rather that one is using, in some sense, the core of repressed instinct to build cultural character. So this is the last slide here. And I think it's an important slide. So he says, and this is interesting to think about. Here he's giving us the three outcomes for the unconscious wishes which are, quote unquote, set free by psychoanalysis. And again, thinking about freedom in the context of psychoanalysis, I think requires a philosophical challenge which may be already represented in the work of someone like Slavoj Žižek. But the idea here is that the most frequent outcome of the unconscious wishes in analysis is that merely the adult condemningly judges the wish. And the reason why this condemning judgment works is that the adult self is capable of mastering what the youthful self could not master. So basically, there is a emotional maturity which is gained vis-a-vis the unconscious wishes, which was incapable to be approached in the earlier phases of life. The second outcome is that the energy of the unconscious wishes is used for social purposes, which would have manifested naturally in the development of the subject if the subject had not been disturbed ultimately in their erotic needs. So I think what this is emphasizing here for me when we're thinking about education at large is that we cannot just expect people to become highly educated and highly intellectual without their erotic needs being met. That erotic needs are an essential component of an intellectual's development. You cannot separate the two. We need to be able to develop our intellects while also being subtly aware of our deepest erotic needs in essence. And then finally, the third point, that some portion of the repressed libido may in fact have a legitimate claim to a direct expression or satisfaction, namely in the expression of sexual activity, and that civilization, and this is again in Freud's time, and to some degree this might be true today, but I think less so, that civilization should be less judgmental of certain sexual acts. We can discuss whether that is still true today or not, but that basically covers the 5 lectures on psychoanalysis. And there you see a sort of summary of all 5 lectures. And I just thank you so much for your attention. I know that was a little bit long, but now we can sort of stop listening to me and open up conversation.
Excellent presentation, I'd say. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And also, I would like to say that it's nice to note the type of like blunder that you made earlier, and I may say that you are forgiven, and when eventually we are going to be relocated to the retraining camps or gulags or whatever, then when I will sell myself to the officers, I will tell them that maybe you could have less of spanking.
All right. Yeah, no, I appreciate the spanking. You get out the whip if you like. I have a cat friend on my bed that just vomited all over my bed, which is I wanted to prevent in the middle. I was like, oh shit, it's vomiting on my bed.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, so 5 lectures. I know someone had their hand raised during the presentation. If you wanted to ask your question now, this would be.
Yes. Thank you. It was amazing, very informative. And I just like in this part where you mentioned the child sexuality, could we think of it as the unsplit being, as in that then when it goes into language, it splits into subject?
Yeah, so I don't know. I mean, I can approach this question, but I'd also open it up to either Mika or Eric or anyone else who has a knowledge of this if they'd want to give their own opinion on this.
Well, is it the idea that basically there is no unconscious before the installation of language? Before that, there is no split into conscious and unconscious in a way. And in this sense, unconscious is a bit unfortunate term, since it refers to something like negative or something like that. But basically, unconscious is just this type of like vanishing point, which emerges as a split that occurs only when we are speaking. I mean, developmentally, like when we are at the stage of starting to speak.
Yes, that's exactly right. And Lacan demonstrates this in his graphs of desire and the different cells of the graphs. In the first graph of desire, the barred subject, the split subject, is on the left-hand side. So, and I'll try to reverse this in my, as the loop kind of goes up and around as it encounters the big other, the treasure trove of signifiers. That's where the split occurs, and as it finishes its traversal, you have the barred subject as the result of that. Okay. Now, in the other cells of the graph, he reverses it so that the barred subject is at the origin point. Okay. So initially, he shows the where the split occurs, and that is in that initial encounter with the big other and language, the name of the father, and so on. So we could see then this early period of childhood development, where the dreams are literal and so on, is at this early stage where the full splitting of subjectivity has not yet occurred, but it's in that process of traversing that first cell of the graph.
Does that answer your question, Sandra? Or?
Yes, I believe it might give me a hint. Thank you.
Well, yeah, David, did you want to say?
Yeah, I have a question too.
Okay, yeah, let's get to your question. I just wanted to sort of maybe dwell for a little moment on this idea of the unsplit being, and then language splits us. It's like I relate to this back with the idea that the unconscious knows no. I just think about, like, for example, the infant in their expression of pleasure, like with this the unconscious is basically this, like Nietzsche's yay-sayer, like this pure affirmation, like the just this pure yes type of thing. And then the no only comes here, and like the no only comes, we have someone coming in. The no only comes in again with this split into language, and then the sort of what I'm sort of interested in on a deeper level though is whether or not when the infant is born itself, whether or not there is that primordial split of embodiment in some sense, because you have the infant in the womb and there's in some sense a pure unity with the mother, or unity in the sort of environs of the of the mother. And then once you're born, the entire process of birth is extremely disturbing when you think about it from the point of view of the infant. I mean, it's got to be the ultimate terrifying disturbance. And then you have the fact that you're in this purely impotent body, and if you are at the mercy of all these forces without proper care, I mean, I think you already have a type of split, if that makes sense. But the unconscious energy is just this yes.
I'd like to make a connection to the kind of spiritualist ideas of some type of like primordial unity, which might be tempted to posit at the beginning, or as this mythical oneness that we try to grasp in like, well, through our language. But well, yeah, there is a difference between conceiving of the like original state as a mythical oneness, and also, well, the difference between recognizing the origin as somehow already barred from us. I think that the question would be that if there is a type of access to some type of primordial unity of being beneath all appearances or whatever, then the question is always, what type of access do we have? Well, they have to posit some kind of like special gnosis or special knowledge of this, and they always have some kind of like traditional method for knowing this unity.
Yes.
I think,
Go for it.
To your point. Oh, sorry. To your point. Actually, I was reading last night Lacan's Seminar 4, which is just newly published, and I got it last week, so I'm reading through it, and he actually says this very thing that you were saying. In chapter 3, he says that the image of the body that the infant has is not an object, and it cannot become an object. And so for the infant, at that particular stage, the you know what it encounters as you know, its own body, but also the breast, you know, the different what we think of as objects are not yet experienced as objects. It's not until the mirror stage that switch is flipped, where the body becomes an object. And
yeah, I think.
Go ahead.
I think it's spot on, this reference to the mirror image, because in that concept, Lacan expresses this alienation in the core of identification, because before that, the child is not really, it's just like a multitude of drives. And when he recognizes himself in the mirror, which is a symbolic also, then, you know, later on, Lacan says that this is not really an experience that is in the mirror, but it can be a symbolic identification. But it's like that there is in the image, the main concept is like this alienation in the core of identification, which I think is really strong. So I think that unity, as Mika was pointing out, is an illusion, is a fantasy, because even when you are in the womb, you think you are one, but you are not, right? You are two, because there is the mother and there is the child, and the child has this fantasy that he is one, but he's not. And then he realized that when he has to go out of the womb and get, and there he really faced reality, the real as it is, and the fantasy just collapses and destroys.
I think I think in order to be deeply like this like you may say like this yaysayer, or this I don't know, this not a whole, like maybe use not, instead of unity, maybe you could use the word whole, but not in a mythical sense, but just that one has to be comfortable with the fact that one is a split subject in order to really live. Because if you're constantly living under this idea of a mythical unity, you're in some sense desiring to die. You know, like you don't want to be alive. Like in order to be alive, you have to be split subject in some sense, and you just have to sort of that's why I like this idea that affirming contradiction and sort of embodying the split itself is the way to really live, because otherwise you're just always searching for an identity in a perfect unity, which is in some sense an illusion of this sort of primordial memory. And interestingly, I've talked to some, I love talking to, for example, people who are either midwives or have a good understanding of childbirth and all that process, because I've talked to some midwives who have said that actually infants in the womb are already in some sense perturbed. Like like it's already a trouble in the womb.
Yeah.
But
to improvise a little bit about different philosophers, well, Plotinus is really the philosopher who brings into culmination or fulfillment the kind of metaphysics that is present in Plato and Aristotle. But in Plotinus, we have an argument against Aristotle, or Aristotle's nous, or the intellect or the mind, as a like bringer of unity. Well, the basic argument is that, well, there's two arguments, but the more important is that for Plotinus, the like mind or the thinking part, it always brings about a dualism or a split. So what Plotinus's metaphysics presupposes is that there is some further access, some other access to the unity of everything, which must be there always, the unity of everything with everything else in a way. But when we come to somebody like Hegel, well, Hegel, I think, associates Plotinus or his way of thinking with the figure of unhappy consciousness, because for Hegel, Plotinus is in a way caught by the idea that there is some type of special access to the unity of everything, and this is sort of like an event that takes place in some like period of the subject's life, and then the subject kind of like lingers on or attaches to the experience of the unity, and sort of just practices the philosophy as a reminiscence of this experience of unity. Whereas for Hegel, the process or the movement of the concept in the very formation of philosophy it cannot be detached from the unity. The unity itself is a like emergent category within the formation of philosophy itself.
Mika, I was actually thinking exactly about Hegel's unhappy consciousness, specifically at that last point of lecture 5, where Cadell, you were talking about the notion of freedom, and we don't really understand our own freedom until we understand how we're determined. And that's exactly how the dialectic of the master-slave turns out and ends up in the unhappy consciousness. Is the slave doesn't realize his own freedom, the freedom of his consciousness, until he works through the dialectic of that relationship. And the result of that, going through skepticism and so on, is the unhappy consciousness, which is this process of unification that it's so difficult to understand in his text. But yeah, that's a good point, Mika.
Can we also put it like this regarding wholeness? Can we say that before the symbolic order in imaginary, it's the subject that wants to be whole, one, in the eye of ego ideal, whereas when the subject enters the symbolic order, it's not the subject that is perceived as whole, but it's the world. So can we make this distinction regarding wholeness? I mean, in imaginary, the subject, in the eye of the ego ideal, it's the subject that is the whole, or thinks that he or she is whole. Whereas in the symbolic order, it's not the subject, but on the contrary, it's the world that he or she perceives as a whole, or a unity, or oneness, whatever we call it.
All right, I'll open that up to everyone. I just want to let David know that you're going to have a question, and then I think Alexandra, you also had your hand up, so we'll go David then Alexandra. But Evren's question, if anyone wants to field that, I can, or someone else can feel free to. I would definitely say that the sort of in the mode of the symbolic order and the searching for wholeness, I do think that at least in the philosophical and the scientific mode of adult consciousness, it always seems like the wholeness is being sought for in the world, but also in the political sphere as well. If you think about like global communism, or if you think about, for example, Islam, or any of the religions which want to sort of universalize themselves, like through proselytizing, they're searching for an external unity. They're searching for the entire world to reflect their ego ideal.
Yes, I agree. That's what I was saying.
So David, if you had a question, and then Alexandra, we'll go to you.
Yes. So you talked before about the arrogance of the consciousness in recognizing the contradiction, no? That it has this resistance in recognizing the contradiction. But once you recognize the contradiction, you accept the contradiction, or you need to solve the contradiction. And is this process has an end? I mean, do you reach, I think it's related to what we were talking right before about the unity, no? The womb, etc. But
yes, there's no end.
Is there like a point? Just a second that I finish my point. Is there like a point where you reach like an impossible contradiction that can't be solved, and that at that point then what you can do? I mean, for example, you talked about the end of analysis for Freud, and that part reminded me the end of analysis for Lacan, which is like love, no? Love as giving what you don't have, no? Being capable of donating an absence, right? Your personal absence.
Yes.
And so is that like the point where you reach that fundamental contradiction, that impossible contradiction that can be solved only through this act of love, namely donating the absence, so the contradiction. Yeah, that's my question.
I think what you're saying, I think it's brilliant what you're articulating here. I think it's difficult to answer about the end of all contradictions. How I think about it anyway in general is that contradictions of my identity are always going to emerge, and whether or not I can accept and work with those contradictions, not towards their final resolution, but towards some sort of resolution which opens up different identities. That's how I think about it. But then when you're bringing up this point about love in the end of analysis and being able to give what we don't have and basically give this absence, that does give me the feeling of some sort of qualitative transition in identity, which is of a different order, so to speak. And yeah. I would just say, and then please respond, but I would just say that when this qualitative transformation occurs, I think that one's emotional reaction to the persistence of contradiction simply changes, that one is, in fact, enjoys that contradiction is continuing to emerge.
Yeah, I love that. I think you said that this word qualitative transformation. That's, I think, is key, because my own research in this is like try to find a model that can substitute the identity politics. And so can we go beyond identity, really? Can we just like identify with an absence? So with an absence of identity, and what that means for the subject, because that would mean the giving up of individuality, basically, and just like the core of a collective intelligence, you know, somehow that is going beyond identities and so individualities.
I would say that in order for the subject to emotionally be able to do that, one has to truly enjoy their aloneness.
Yeah.
One has to be able to truly enjoy their capacity to be with self on a deep level, because otherwise you can't really socially relate in this way.
Yes.
I
love you, man. I love you, man.
I just want to say one small thing over here.
Go for it.
I just sort of spoil the party a little in that sense. You know, we think about this contradiction, this gap in a very general, in a fixed sense. What is important to think about over here is that this gap is a very particular form of knowing. It's not a general form of knowing. It always emerges in a particular way to us. So you may not be able to have a general, universal way of, you know, with the distinction that Lacan would make between non-all and the universal all in that sense. You will not be able to have a generalized, rule-based relationship with this gap. You know, if that missing link could have been completed, the whole story would have been over. We could have just been machined and the story would have been, you would always need to reform that link at each point. At each point, that process has to take place again and again, which is why end becomes a very tricky issue over there, because that process cannot have any fixed modes of engagement in that sense. So that gap, even though that gap is always there, it always emerges to be in a very particular form at a particular point in each time, and that, which is why entity politics is so difficult to overcome in that sense. You know,
just to punctuate what you're saying, both of you are saying, Lacan in Seminar 4, Chapter 1, he says that the subject turns himself into an object for the other party.
Yeah.
So there's something about, you know, the way we subjectify ourselves, it's specifically for the other.
I'd just like to add very briefly, there's an excellent explication of this can be found from Hannah Arendt's the last chapter on, which is added later, on the origins of totalitarianism, where she is discussing the difference between solitude proper and the type of loneliness that takes place in the chaos and the mess of the contemporary ideological reality out there. So she is talking about the way that the party, the third party, or the party itself, or the movement, sort of tends the subject to enact a unity of the subject with the cause, but this brings about only further torment, as she explains.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just again, before getting to Alexandra's question, I just wanted to sort of reaffirm this dynamics of the gap and the gap and generalized rule-based relationship, is that we have to be subtle here. And I think there's so much at stake here with basically the temporality of law and the temporality of regulation, that we cannot just have no regulation or we cannot just have no law, but that we also have to be aware of the dynamism and the temporality of the law, that we can't just be in the gap, and we also can't just have fixed static law. This is I think a lot is at stake here. Alexandra?
Thank you. I would like to answer to Sandra, but I would like to ask her, Sandra, could you repeat your question?
It was that if we could think, is there's because I've just mentioned this in an earlier, I just wrote this paper, and where I affirmed that child sexuality before the being or what exists is immersed in language. Could we think of that as the unsplit being, and that then splits into subject, and because this unsplit being, they mentioned that it's pleasure, but then I mean it would also be anxiety, and I mean yeah, the child feels pleasure, but then it doesn't really understand. I'm sorry, and yeah, that was my question. If there is a way to understand it like that, because I don't want to then realize I just said something awful in my recent paper. Thank you.
Okay, because I understood maybe something else in another way your question. What I wanted, I understood like that, that you are interested in what is the child before the language. If there is unconscious and conscious before language, or if there is a split of the child before language. I was thinking this is your question. Okay, I just wanted to add something. When we are talking about unconsciousness, it is very important to take in consideration that there are philosophies that consider that the child, or not the child, the subject is not tabula rasa, as a child's tabula rasa that comes into the world. But as Davide Pasti said, it's very important to take in consideration that we begin to identify as being a unified subject only through that mirror image stage. And before that, what are we? And from this point of view, there are philosophies, phenomenologies that consider that beyond the psychoanalytical unconscious, there is a phenomenological unconscious with so-called wild essences, and you just can't correlate them with a subject. There is no subject there. There are just wild essences. There is a whole wild architectonic of coming and going. It's very difficult to describe it in words. It's like it's before the subject. It's before language, before subject. Even we can say it's
Ineffable?
What?
Ineffable?
Ineffable?
Yeah, like
yes, you can say ineffable if you want, or wild, or so
it's just an attempt to put in symbols something that is genuinely like emotion or something like that. It's just a,
yes, or impressions, let's say impressions. So and
well, can I ask about this idea?
Because in this way we get out from the idea that a subject is an organism. So we just leave the positivist biology paradigm a little, you know, and enter a phenomenological paradigm.
Can I ask about this notion, since it brings to mind the question whether this would be for Lacan an other of the other? Do you agree that it would be like an other of the other?
No, there is. I think you can't talk about an other. There is beyond this identification as other, as subject, a split subject. There are just impressions. There are just, there is no subject there.
Well, but you were saying that there is a beyond unconscious of the unconscious.
Yes, in a way, yes, yeah.
So it
Yes.
is another of the other.
For me, when you say other, for me, this other represents in a way an identity, you know, while I'm talking about something beyond identity.
Something ineffable.
Just wild impressions, wild, I don't know, sensations, impressions, maybe words, ideas, I don't know. So something very, something between no thing and thing.
Alexandra, would I just want to have a question? Are you trying to think of that wild impressions in a very neutral way, or do you think there is a lack of neutrality in that wildness also? Are those wild impressions purely neutral things, or there is some kind of a charge already implicated within that space?
I think
That
there
would
is.
be my way of.
I do not believe in neutrality.
You don't believe in
There is no neutrality.
neutrality. Okay. So
But there is, if it is beyond words,
yeah,
you can't say it. You can't label good or bad.
Yeah, but Alexander, wouldn't that be the case if there is no neutrality? If we both sort of agree upon that, then that little bit of charge in that space, that little charge, already creates a subject position, doesn't it?
Can you repeat?
That if there is no neutrality, there is already a certain twist in the space, certain minimum amount of charge in the space. Doesn't that already create a subject position?
A what?
A subject position.
I don't know.
If there is, subject is that lack of neutrality. Subject is sort of defined through that lack of neutrality in space, isn't it? Subject emerges from this little bit. So wouldn't that minimal level
for me, it is an excess that wants to come and to manifest in that wants to come to become and to individuate in something.
Alexandra,
exactly.
I would put here's an idea, like with this idea that it's an excess that wants to become something, and that in your speech you're positioning it as something before, whereas I think that at least in Alenka Zupancic, What is Sex, it's positioned as something that's always already here now, like namely the wandering excess, but that when we search for something before, what we're actually doing is trying to put something temporally like preceding our existence, which is actually here right now, if that makes sense.
I agree.
Namely, the wandering excess.
Yes, I agree totally.
Okay.
I agree totally.
Isn't that what Freud?
And the problem with the wandering excess is, and this now precisely how you're describing it as well, actually, this wandering excess as like no neutrality, beyond words, you can't label it good or bad, all this types of things, just these wild impressions. I think that the problem is that this wild excess is both our deepest potential and an enormous problem for regulation and law.
Isn't that
yes. It
death
is
drive
beyond
itself?
law.
Yeah, it is beyond law.
It's
Absolutely.
beyond the pleasure principle.
Yeah, in some sense, yeah.
And that goes to Freud's what Freud says, and Lacan repeats quite a lot, is that the finding of the object is always the refinding of the object.
Yes.
So there's always something prior to our quest.
I just sort of want to add something here. So the O'Neill discussion you were having, this idea of sort of language splitting us in that sense. Maybe if you think about it the other way around, it would be more interesting, Sandra's question. The idea being that, in some senses that split the unconscious in that sense is the primary thing. And then, which is why you say unconscious structured like a language in that sense, that it is from that split itself the symbolic domains find its root. So in that sense, human beings are not the adult or the child is not the exception to the rule. in that sense that, you know, there is a non-split and then there's an exception to the split and so on and so forth. But as say Alenka Zupanci could talk about it, that human beings are a sort of a structural exception in that sense that they sort of, you know, so there's an unconscious everywhere, but it manifests itself in a particular way, in a full way in the human subject in that sense. That is where the language or linguistic capacity takes its
I think, Chetan, I think it's about taming the wild. So the language is taming. You say in English, taming. To tame something that is wild. That's the word.
No, I'm not saying.
Well,
language.
That's how Lacan. That's how Lacan presents the symbolic order in Seminar 2, and he specifically relates that function of the symbolic order to the death drive. That whereas the imaginary, this unbridled cathextion of psychical energy, the untamed wild that Alexander was talking about, that's essentially psychosis. You know, the unsplit subject is psychosis. And so we're all essentially caught between neurosis and psychosis. And we can't find a middle ground of wholeness. You know, if we don't have this split, then we're psychotic, right? So there is this this quest, this refinding of the object that is, you know, the drive, the death drive or whatever, that that is, at least in Seminar 2 at this stage of his thought, is synonymous with the activity of the symbolic order of reining in that over the excess of cathextion.
I agree, you know, and you know, interesting thing about a discussion on unity is that if you could actually achieve unity, the whole problem of unity would be over. The whole point of unity becomes interesting precisely because you know, you can't ever completely you know, in that sense, it's always
and that's the death drive. It's always orbiting around that object. The object is the unity. You know, the object is the unity, and you know, and it's the unity of the other that we constantly circle, and that trying to find that unity.
Exploitation of the drive and extension of the drive. You know, those two things become extremely interesting. You know, you can completely submit that, collapse the drive, or you can extend it. You know, that distinction which they, you know, even Freud makes in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. That's extremely interesting, that the way he sort of, you know, situates it.
Yeah, I would just add to this point, which I think is so important about unity being, if the unity was actually actualized, it would be death, which is, I mean, no offense to, no, I'm not going to say, but just that this striving for the unity and like, if you actualize the unity, it would be totally just dead. Like, again, every political project, every religious project which has this as its aim, even scientific project which has this as its aim, and just totally unreflective on the level of psychoanalysis. And I think that's why psychoanalysis actually, like, and psychoanalysts in general should be more bold in their capacity to engage with science and politics and religion and other fields, because I think that what is discovered in the split subject has relevance to the types of unconscious motivations which are always already at work in these other fields. I think this is a huge potential. So I know there are people with hands up. Mika, did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, yeah, it's definitely a fascinating discussion that you have, but maybe if I can, I would like to make a detour here and elaborate on something that I have been trying to articulate from the very beginning of our very series on returning to Freud. Like, elaborate perhaps a bit more lengthy comment here, but something that I was thinking when reading the lectures that we are discussing here. So the point that I have been trying to just grasp is what's the difference between Freud and the type of contemporary figure of so-called scientific psychologist or the university psychologist. So I think that I have been trying to point this out in early meetings that we have. But here, I think that it's perhaps the best place to do this, since these lectures are really excellent for getting to know what Freud is really on about, what's new about his approach. So perhaps just to ask, why psychology? This is an open question. Why is it the case that everybody today seems to be so fascinated about the field of psychology? I mean, if you take a random person from the streets and ask them what is she or he interested in, it's usually like, I'm so interested in knowing what human mind is like, and then they are tingling with psychology and the textbooks that psychology offers us. But the difference with Freud, I think, is that when Freud is pointing out that the main interest that he has is into, quote, the small faulty actions performed by both normal and neurotic people, to which, as a rule, no importance is attached. So there are things that, in principle, they are to be ignored. So things like forgetting things, just slips and bungled action, losing objects or breaking them, and all of these, quote, things for which, as a rule, no psychological determinants are sought, and which are allowed to pass without any criticism as consequences of distraction or inattention to similar causes. So I think that this is a very important point, but when Freud is insisting that these things have a meaning always, it's a very bizarre thing to do, in a sense, since he's saying that they have a meaning that can be interpreted quite easily. I mean, I might now stumble, or when I write something, I might be constantly doing spelling mistakes. And Freud would say that there is some meaning to this bungled action. So the way I see it is that a person who is fascinated about psychology, they would like to really know about human mind or have a model of the human mind, but they would be driven to, I would say, paranoia, even if somebody were to say to them that pay attention to not only to the big things of like love and personality, but just the really minuscule mistakes. And I think that this is an approach that goes way deeper, which actually means, I mean, the whole depth psychology means just to take notice of what is on the surface always going on already. And when Freud is saying that these things are usually not appreciated, but in a sense, we are always looking for, when we go into psychology, some kind of like unitary cause for everything. I think that this is missing in Freud, since he says that whereas what seems to be our innate craving for causality declares itself satisfied with a single cause, single psychical cause, the kind of like the one or the unity for everything, and attaining some type of special gnosis through university would presumably result in a positive state of wisdom. I mean, they do discuss about wisdom to quite an extent today in psychology, but here the task is just to bring the type of pathogenic material into consciousness so as to get just rid of certain ailments that have been brought about by substitutive formations. So just to conclude, my point is that I think that the kind of like power structure that is at play in psychology, it is best represented by the iceberg model that we earlier were discussing in, I think, a couple of meetings before. The kind of power structure, you know, where only the tip is at the surface, only the high point is at the surface and nose. And the further down you go from the tip or the top of the pyramid, the more splittings always occur, but the deeper for them it gets. I mean, they, like, I think purposefully completely mystify things. They obfuscate things so as to make them into mysteries, whereas I would like to risk the hypothesis that there is no mystification in Freud, even with dreams. And well, my question would be for any psychologist, and I hope that there are no psychologists here present. But yeah, it would be that what would be really to be really like efficient and proficient and expert in psychology. I mean, Freud is saying that, or emphasizing the way that it is really rigorous to go undertake the training of the method that and it fits the material. But what would be the kind of like proficiency at psychology? I would say that in contrast to Freud, psychologists would have to be a complete pervert. They would have to always know. Everything would be brought under the one tip of knowledge always. But this is missing in Freud, since he emphasizes that one has to listen really closely for things that are deemed irrelevant for the psychologists today. So perhaps, just this is my point, that psychologists would be
to your point. I wanted to I wanted to bring up that Freud himself withdraws from the radicality of his own position, and I saw this in the lectures. To kind of bring it back to the text that we're studying, when he talks about the interpretation of dreams in these lectures, and I think it was lecture 3, he's talking about that, you know, the real meaning of the dream is in the latent content of the dream. And that's exactly what he says in the interpretation of dreams. However, there's a footnote that he makes in 1925, and Zizek brings this up in the opening chapter of the Sublime Object of Ideology, which is particularly that later on he comes to say that the real import of the dream work is in the dream work itself. That is, it's in the obfuscation between the latent content and the manifest content. Because when he goes through his own analysis of his own dream, the dream of Irma's injection, the real meaning of the dream is not in the latent content. It's in his own counter-transference in his sexual attraction to Irma that he never talks about. And so he withdraws from the radicality of his own position, that it is really the erotic nature of the psyche that is the actual cause of these symptoms. And this is a point that Zizek makes, the point that Boothby makes, is that, you know, Freud withdraws when he gets up to, he manifests his own resistance, and he never goes to actually getting to the radicality of his own position.
Yeah, that's really.
And so,
really
you know, you have to be.
But I don't agree.
Eric, I just want to just sort of clarify. Are you sort of saying that claim that unconscious lies on the surface itself? It's not like deep within. Is that the point you're trying to make?
No, I'm saying that.
Yeah,
I'm saying that the actual unconscious wish that's repressed was not Freud's anxiety about mistreating Irma. It was his own sexual attraction to her in the countertransference. That's what had been repressed, and that's what was actually causing even the latent content to be manifest. You know, and that's a point that both Zizek and Boothby have made in their analysis of that. And so in the text that we're reading, where he's talking about dreams as the latent content, and later on in 1925, he makes that very point and it's a footnote in the standard edition. It's page 506, and Zizek quotes it, but you can find it, where he says, no, the real substance of the dream is in the dream work itself, the actual distortion. And I think David disagrees with me. So.
No, I disagree. I disagree with the word you choose, which is like, can you hear me?
Good.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I disagree with the word you are choosing to describe this element. You choose the word substance. That's the whole point. I don't think it's a withdrawal from his radical position. Actually, it's the opposite. It's even more radical, because the latent subject is not substance, like Jung is saying, but it's the void. It is that black hole that is always out of the language somehow, no? But is embedded in the language itself. Okay, but it's that singularity. And so that's it. That's why the important thing is the work of the dream, because there is no ground under it. So then it becomes like that's the drive, right? That's the drive that is never gets to somewhere, but it's just like circulating around a vortex that has no substance. That's why.
Eric,
right, but
I'd be right if I were to say this. Your point is that Freud is kind of like underselling his like project.
Yeah, and I don't want to. I don't disagree with David at all. I agree, and I think that, but around that vortex, what is there is this countertransference, this erotic core to it that that he explains in lecture 4. Oh, there, everything comes down to this erotic, this libido, and that's really the essence of that singularity, that black hole. That gravitational force is this kind of eroticism. It manifests itself in the countertransference that was involved in the dream of Irma's injection. But no, I take what you're saying, and I totally agree.
Well, the way I understood was that you're trying to also say that Freud is a bit like Zizek says, doesn't really recognize the radicality, or maybe he withdraws in a way that he doesn't really emphasize what he should have emphasized, or alternatively, he's just underselling his project,
or to David's point, he just can't say it. Because there is this resistance, and there's nothing there for him to say.
No, I don't think it is like, it's an Hegelian move. It is an Hegelian move. So it's not a withdrawal from the radicality of the position. It's the opposite. It's even more radical. Do you think that Zizek would just like pointing out how Freud is not as radical as he would like to be? I think he is mentioning that point exactly to show how radical Freud is, or how can you read Freud even in a more radical way that he did himself. And that's exactly what Zizek is doing by desubstantializing. Can you say that? Sorry for my pronunciation, but to suck away the substance from the unconscious. The unconscious is not substance. It's formal. It's totally formal. Yeah. And so it's the less than nothing. It's the less than nothing. And so that is the radicality. That's completely blow your head, that's blow your head out.
Right. Well, so just to clarify, when I'm saying, when I say he withdraws from his from that radicality, I mean that early on, when he first writes Interpretation of Dreams, and even in these lectures, he's withdrawing from the radicality that he then arrives to in 1925 with that extra footnote that Zizek brings out. So I think that maybe we misunderstood each other there, but I agree.
Okay.
Mika?
Yeah. Alexander?
Mika, I would like to answer to your question about Freud, and to ask you about this pyramid. Do you think that you wanted to say that Freud was turning the pyramid upside down, in the sense that he liberated, rehabilitated the so-called patients with their symptoms and gave them power? Do you think he considered that there is no expert, and that the real expert is the suffering symptomatic person, and we have just to open and to listen to the symptom and to the patient? Because I think the problem you brought is the problem of power, the so-called white power of the expert, while Freud opened and liberated the patients. He had the capacity to say, I don't know, and I'm listening to you, and I let you make me understand and observe and develop a new science.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. But yeah, what I was trying to say is definitely related to power and the type of like Freudian points that the way that certain power structure organizes our experience, in a way predetermines what we can say even in analysis and even in the expert's office. But the type of contradiction or difference between the normal sort of scientific psychologist and Freud, I think, is exemplified in the way that the contemporary psychologists would be attracted to the notion of unconscious as an iceberg, which just keeps on going further down below, gets more murky, more mysterious, and probably continues indefinitely towards the bottom. Whereas for Freud, I think this doesn't apply, since everything is on the surface already, and the way that our presuppositions function, they eliminate usually the possibility for a psychologist to just listen and take notice of what is going on, because it's not deemed as something that's for value for a person of knowledge.
Do you think they are afraid of unconscious?
Well, doesn't Freud say quite something like this in lecture?
They're absolutely afraid of it.
I think that Freud brings out these points really cleverly.
They're in the business of knowledge, and they're in the business of, well, but more specifically, it's ego psychology. They're interested in the business of egoic conscious knowledge. So it's exactly the point at the end of this 5 lectures where Freud's saying one of the obstacles to psychoanalysis is, in some sense, the arrogance of consciousness, is in some sense the fact that consciousness has a predisposition to be finding the discoveries of psychoanalysis and unconscious as peculiar and perverse and obscene. There's a very strong resistance to unconscious knowledge by the very egos which are upholding the normative discourse of scientific.
Yes, Kadel, but you know, I think this is very important what I try to say now, even if I don't speak English very well. I still consider that in order to free yourself from your ego and to start and to enter the adventure of exploring the unconscious and to go to the deepest, even beyond the subject levels of unconscious in regression and in epoche and whatever, meditation, contemplation, whatever methods you want, or psychoanalytic method, before that, you need a strong ego. So you need this ego in order to let it go.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Because if you don't have this ego, I don't know, it's my idea, maybe I'm wrong, but in my opinion, in our civilization, in our world, we need, through individuation, through education, through these relations and identifications with parents, with models, whatever, to become an ego and to feel our unity of the ego and identification with our image and so on, in order to let it go, because it's a very risky and it's a very risky adventure. So it's very important to be able to be ego and not ego, to play, to have the power to play with these things.
Alexandra, I would just like to make the point that I think everything you say is important.
Yeah, it's all on the surface always.
No, but of course. And I think
everybody's most intimate secrets are all, as a rule, always betrayed by their own health, as Freud says.
Yeah, and I don't know. I guess sometimes I've tried to express this building up of the ego in order to let it go in other ways. Maybe not in this workshop, but I've thought about it as in terms of whether it's you're someone who's, as it were, accumulating knowledge or accumulating money or accumulate just whatever it is you're accumulating in your process of development. At a certain point, you realize that accumulation is not the thing in itself and that you have to let it go. But nonetheless, the entire process of accumulation has its sort of processual value. like what you're saying, the building up of a strong ego does have a sort of processual value, as long as you realize it's not the thing in itself, and it's driven by some sort of illusion or distortion, which is in some sense going to involve, I think, a type of pain or a type of at least discomfort with the crumbling of one's identity at some point.
I would like to
I don't know
say,
if that's, we're a tragic species in that sense. Mika?
Yeah, I would like to say that I am in complete disagreement about the need or whatever of having a strong ego.
Can you go into that?
The purpose of freeing oneself.
Can you explore that?
I think that everybody, like every one of us, have certain presuppositions going on about what is going to be agreeable to others, and the way that we are going to form our own case is going to be in conformity with our presuppositions, which predetermine what we are going to say and how we are going to think about, or how we think that others are going to receive our own case for what is valuable and what is not valuable. And I think that this type of approach, in a way, is in conformity with the type of special gnosis view, which is not Freud's project. And I think that this is more in conformity with the idea of what Zizek discusses as the enlightened Western type of Buddhism, where we are entirely obliged to free ourselves, to explore our creative potential at every instance. And yeah, I think that this type of approach is not in complete contradiction with Freud, since he's saying that say whatever comes to your mind, even if it's irrelevant or nonsensical, and try to overcome the presuppositions which try to predetermine or restrict the scope of your language. But this type of association with the content of the free ego wouldn't be more authentic than the ego that's already in action in normal life, even if it's as weak as hell or anything like that. I mean, the crucial contradiction, or the opposition isn't between the strong and weak ego. It's in the ability to explore the way that some type of associative link predetermines what we are going to be able to say.
Alexander, did you have anything? Did you want to respond to that, or no?
I actually.
Chitan, go ahead.
Yeah.
For me,
I just want to.
For me, it was not very clear what Mika said, but as I understood, he considered that you don't need an ego. That
I don't know if one needs an ego.
When I say ego,
I don't know if
one needs an ego.
If one needs an ego.
Okay, I think when I think ego, I'm thinking also to this mirror stage, that you identify with your image, that you identify with some roles, that you identify with your body, that you are not a hand, a nose, the eye of the other. So you have a unity of yourself, even if this unity is mirage. But I'm old-fashioned. I still need it in order to let it sometimes a little go. I still need it. I'm sorry that I'm primitive. I'm primitive. I still need it, but maybe it's possible without. I don't know, but
but it's whole
and I think this construction of the ego is in the soft of life. The life has such a soft that the individuation constructs this ego in order to let it go before dying, for instance. I think it's in the soft of life.
If you're on the project of what Anna Freud is describing as the ego analysis, or analysis of resistances, I am opposed to this because the crucial thing isn't the ego, but the discourse, as Lacan would say.
Just sort of making a sort of.
I think we define differently ego. We have to define what is ego.
Yeah, if we think about ego as a
go ahead.
Yeah, if we think about ego as a minimal amount of self-identification, this redoublement that takes place. Ego essentially is an ability to identify A. If you look at Russell's paradox, the problem of how does A identify back with A. That initial problem which sort of has been sort of hounding us since centuries in that sense. And if we take ego as a process of that identification in that sense, so even if, and that paradox will always be there, that you can't completely identify with yourself. That is of course true. There is no taking away from that. And to that degree, ego project is a failure. But to even reach that point of failure, you have to make that identification possible for yourself. If you break that identification process itself, then the whole structure would completely, in that sense, go haywire.
The disagreement is with the desideratum or the aim of the project. And I think that there is a comment about the reading that I have might be relevant to this. That's when one reads these lectures, Freud is so much emphasizing the relevance of defenses of repression that one might derive the impression that what is at stake in analysis is the overcoming of defenses and repressions, whereas this isn't really the case, as Lacan puts it. Since this gives the kind of image of Freud as some like authoritarian who tries to just perform an analysis of like liquidization of every defense so that he can, as a master, grasp the kind of like ore from which he transforms precious metals or something like this. I mean, Lacan would point out that even if there is this type of like resistance going on, which needs to be countered in analysis, there is something more subtle always going on in there than just conquering of the subjects, like resistance. And Lacan says that this like authoritarianism that's attributed to Freud of this kind of like conquistador of resistance, this is somewhat misplaced or paradoxical, since in the relation where the subject encounters the like problematic material of his discourse or her discourse, the amount of resistance is going to be like stronger there. But what must take place is that the subject must appropriate the meaning personally. So this leaves the space open for the subject. So it's in a way it's a kind of like Hegelian closure, which is at the same time an opening always.
Always, exactly. Ego is that opening also in that sense. What really interests me is that one of the lines in Lenka Zupanchik What is Sex was that the problem of analysis is that even when you've like diagnosed everything, you found out the problem in the child and what memory was it and all of that stuff, that doesn't cure the patient. That simple act of knowing where the problem isn't necessarily the cure, and then how do we think about that kind of a question, that cure or to that pathology doesn't stem from simply intellectually knowing something. It is eventually a brush or a cut with the real, which in some senses does something to us.
Yeah, I think ultimately, like, yeah, it just going off that point. I mean, even when you've gone through an analysis, I mean, the real as problematic and brutal and terrifying is always there, and so it's I think it really shifts the space of struggle. But it doesn't end struggle. I think the point of the analysis is to sort of become someone who can, I don't know, wisely struggle, or again find another path to fantasy and to actualization of one's drive. even in the face of an overbearing real, that one can bring one's awareness and one's attention to this moment. And sort of in that sense, it upgrades your ability to do battle, or upgrades your capacity to engage with the structure of the real. I'm not sure. Yeah, but I wanted to, but David, I know you had a question. I want to get to that. I want to get to that, but there's something about the resistances and repressions and the way in which I think what Freud did in the project he's engaged in is remarkable in some sense. If I compare it to, I don't know if this is going to be a relevant point, but if any of you guys know Brian Rose from London Real, I did a course with him. He's got a YouTube channel, and his main sort of ideology is to battle resistances. But the way he battles resistances is in some sense a repression of his own inner battle. So I think that there's a distinction here that needs to be made in regards to whether or not one has really battled through the resistances that are necessary to have a deep self-knowing before one is dealing with the resistances of the external outside. I don't know if it flips, but this is, I think this is an important thing, because if you haven't done that self-work, you're battling sort of resistances on the outside, which are again just a delaying of your confrontation with a deeper self-knowledge. David, did you want to say something?
Yeah, it's not a question. It's like a comment about Alexandra's claim about having a strong ego. It comes to mind the concept, Lacan concept of symbolic suicide, you know, that as if like that's also another way how you can see the end of analysis, right? Where the choice is always between a bad choice and a worse choice. And Lacan says, always choose the worst, because choosing the worst is gonna point in yourself to a situation of impossibility where you're gonna experience a symbolical suicide where your ego basically collapse and fragmentates and destroys, and then you manage to reconfigure yourself through another unconscious choice, you know, and then the entire map, the entire symbolical map, it's gonna be transformed. So the ego is part of the problem, because if it's true, like obviously, like the ego is a defense, right? A stronger ego is a stronger defense. And also, does a strong ego needs therapy? Yes, obviously, because if it's true that it's like a defense, even if you have a stronger ego, then it means that somewhere you're gonna have stronger symptoms, right? So, but are you able to recognize these contradictions? Do you have enough, you know, or you are too much arrogant because you have such a strong ego that I don't need therapy, you know, I keep going, I have success, So it's part of the, I think a strong ego is people that go to therapy is because they understand that they have, you know, the ego is not working so well, and so a weaker ego, I think it makes analysis easier. And I want to close this comment by quoting, like, you know, crucial for our discussion, it's that this primordial identification that takes place in the mirror stage is a form of extimité experience. So in between the inner world and the world. So on the threshold of the inner world and the outer world, the most intimate, so my identity, basically what I think it's me, reveals itself as the most external and alien. And I think a strong ego, a blessed situation that could happen to someone that has a strong ego, is a very traumatic situation where he realized the fictional construction of his ego. That what he's always thought, oh, this is me. After this traumatic experience, you realize, oh my God, this is just theater, you know? It's just theater.
Mika? And after Mika, we're gonna do a little closing up because it's been 2 hours, but Mika, go ahead.
Yeah, my only comment about the strong or weak ego program is that for me, it's just an abstract model which Freud doesn't give. And for me, it sounds like this might be one of the great, like, bigger resistance figures, one of them against like going into psychoanalysis, where the interest is into like tiny minuscule things and not into these abstract models of the strong or the weak ego and so on. So the task is just to bring into mind the type of pathogenic material, and this might bring about certain effects, but the type of substitutive formations are already in there in every ego. And the way that I see it is that basically today we might be really like in the illusion that we are going to embark on some kind of like creative mission in our operations, but we are actually quite tormented by substitutive formations all the time. I mean, take a look at how people like how their lives look. It might be like that Freud is right, that most of their life is just this constant symptom after symptom, so many symptoms, just pure symptomatic points all the time. And well, the resistance is just on the ground level already always. But I mean, I think that this type of like abstract modeling might be one of the great resistances also.
All right. Well, on that point, let me just give a little summary for what we've gone through here in the 5 parts. 5 parts on the 5 lectures of psychoanalysis. And again, thank you all for your sort of patience and attention with the longer lecture material today. But I wanted to get through all of that. Let me just put up the screen there so everyone can sort of see, watching here and on YouTube, what we've managed to cover here in the 5 lectures on psychoanalysis, and again over the last 2 workshops. So, you know, really situating psychoanalysis in the origin of psychoanalysis in the sort of the identification of emotional spiritual illnesses. And again, I think it's important to sort of contextualize, as we sort of have said about scientific psychology, that the typical medical doctors or psychologists would not treat or would sort of turn away people who have a quote unquote emotional or spiritual illness. And I think we still do that to this day. You know, I think about so many people in my life, perhaps including myself, who have had emotional spiritual illness and were sort of viewed by the medical or the established authorities as, you know, maybe just take an antidepressant or something like that, or you know, I don't know, maybe get a different job or something like that. You know, so we're sort of you know, not taken seriously in that regard, and psychoanalysis here represents an attempt to take seriously this emotional spiritual illness and really see it, I think, as a positive thing that can really lead to the formation of a different type of subjectivity ultimately. In the taking seriously of the emotional spiritual illness, there's the discovery of the split mind, the conscious and the unconscious, the mechanisms of repression we've all been discussing here, situating perhaps strong ego and weak ego. Maybe a strong ego is an ego that sort of obfuscates or ignores or actively represses this split mind, and maybe, you know, like, as I think we've alluded to a little bit in the discussion, you know, the capacity to be a split subject, the capacity to operate with an awareness of that split is in the affirmation and the working with contradictions, as opposed to trying to be this totally coherent, this totally sort of knowledgeable conscious ego. then going into like what we covered today in part 3 with the different methods psychoanalysts employ. Freud emphasizes free association, which does imply that you have to sort of suspend your strong ego in that sense. The going into dreams, of course, taking seriously the opposite of your ego. Of course, your ego isn't really there when you're dreaming. And also the faulty acts, which in some sense are the undermining of your strong ego, right? Because faulty acts are the opposite of what your strong ego would like to be the case. It really reveals that you are not the master of your own domain, so to speak. And then in part 4, we went into the origin of the symptoms with the infantile sexuality. There's a lot of resistance to this idea that the infant has a sexual being, that sexuality should be understood outside of the context of simply reproductive normative sexuality. I think that this is more important than ever to think about this. And then finally, the aim of psychoanalysis, which is really, I think here opposite to, I think I would re-emphasize, opposite to a withdrawal in a Buddhist or a monistic sense, where you withdraw from reality totally. The point of psychoanalysis is to get one to deal with the asymmetry between fantasy and reality, and ultimately, I think, embody the drive in a way that the subject can actually, I suppose, enjoy the drive and come to terms with its own subjectivity and the nature of reality as a tension and a struggle there. And again, I think echoing a point other people have made, that when the strong ego wants to have a complete unity and a total unity, that this is actually the pleasure principle in service of the death drive, and that the unity is equal to the subject's death. And so again, in order to really be alive, I think we have to affirm the split. So I thank you guys all for your attention. I thank you guys all for your participation. This was a really fantastic discussion. Went a bit longer than usual, but I think it was really, really worth it to go into some of these dimensions. So yeah, thanks again. And I will, as normal, put out a notification in a week and a bit for the next workshop, and welcome you all there, and hope to see most of you there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
everybody. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.